Well, this is the occasional, I guess you'd call it a podcast, videocast, conversation at theofantastic.com. And I'm the one, for better or worse, who puts that together. And I am privileged today not just to have one guest, as I normally do in conversations, but to have a whole handful of guests. And before they introduce themselves, we're going to be talking today about this great book by Doug Cowan, just another in the Cowan canon, I should say, of books on horror and science fiction and religion. Always great stuff. This one is titled The Forbidden Body, Sex, Horror, and the Religious Imagination. So with that title on that topic, the viewer will either now be pulled in and intrigued or disgusted and will tune out. So we'll just go ahead and go with that. Let's begin with some brief introductions. Let's start with the author. Doug, welcome back to Theofantastique.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. I always enjoy coming, whether it's before something gets released or after. And I'm particularly excited today to have colleagues, you're a colleague, but to have others who've sort of known about this stuff for a long time. I mean, James and Laura particularly have been reading this stuff for a couple of years. And one of the things that I mentioned, and I don't know that I said this often enough, is that the thing that we as scholars value most is our time. And the fact that James and Laura were willing to give up time, not once, but twice, to read through this I'm really, really, really appreciative of that. I just want you both to know that. So that's me.
Yeah. James, what about you?
Yeah, well, I'm a longtime fan, and now that I've got the books up, focus on the shelf, I'm currently joining the marketing team in an unofficial capacity. I'm a religion professor and the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair of New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University. And I always throw that in, especially when I'm talking about sci-fi, fantasy, horror, things like that, because usually people are like, New Testament, and so I hope we get to explore some of those intersections and why it is that I branched out into some side interests that intersect with all of yours, and have continued to pursue that avidly, not just as a side interest anymore, but as a major focus of research and teaching and scholarship.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here. Laura.
Hi, I love Doug's work. I've been teaching other aspects of his work for several years and was really delighted to meet him through the American Academy of Religion and Science Fiction unit. I am currently associate professor of religion at Appalachian State University, and my training is all in 16th century Mexican colonialism. But my interests are really in ways that, or I came into this because of how science fiction and lets us reimagine all kinds of first contact scenarios. And I think that makes a kind of nice parallel to the first contact scenario that I write or have done my research about. And that's led me into getting to do some scholarship on what I really love, which is science fiction and fantasy worlds. So I'm really just delighted to be here and appreciate getting to be part of this conversation.
It's great to have you here. Brandon, my frequent collaborator in all things religion and horrific.
Thank you, John. Yes, Brandon Grafius. John and I have co-edited one volume together and are in the process of co-editing two more that we hope will see the light of day one of these days. So yes, I'm associate professor of biblical studies at Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit. I've also recently been appointed academic dean there. We'll see if that was a good decision or not. I first encountered Doug's work as a graduate student, and so it was around 2014, I think, when I stumbled upon Sacred Terror. And then Doug and I met at the Gods and Monsters conference at Texas State University a few years back. Got to listen to some great panels together, share a couple of drinks, and watch a Larry Cowan movie. So really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for including me.
Well, it's great to have you all here. And I thought maybe after the introductions, a way to kind of get started for those who aren't familiar with the book is to have Doug talk a little bit of, maybe summarize it. What was it that led you to dive into this topic, Doug?
Okay, it's a good idea. One of the, it's it's the hardest question to answer. You asked that when we did the Mark Twain thing too. And for me, I don't know about you, but it's a really difficult question for me to answer because I'm always kind of working on this stuff. I mean, it's always kind of rolling around. All of you know what it's like. You're watching something on Netflix and all of a sudden you hit pause and you reach for a notepad, right? And I think with this one, I needed to do the other ones to give me enough of a grounding in terms of what I thought about this stuff to kind of push it a little further, especially with some of the ideas. The book itself is about, there is sex, horror, and the religious imagination. You can find lots of books on religion and horror written from different perspectives. I write from a particular perspective. Brandon writes from a particular perspective. James, John, Laura, we all write from our different backgrounds. So you can find lots of those. You can find lots and lots of books on sex and religion, again, written from a variety of different perspectives. I've often thought about writing like a second-year textbook on sex and religion because I don't think any of them out there are really very good. And then it occurred to me that, there's a chapter, James will remember this from Sacred Terror, there's a chapter towards the end of Sacred Terror on the fear of the body and how we tend to put the body in a state of tension with whatever the religious beliefs are. In fact, there is simply no other aspect of human being that has been so categorized, labeled, marginalized, controlled, dismissed, pick your verb, as the body, especially the sexualized body, and especially the female sexualized body. I mean, we all know so I started thinking about this from that point of view, and I just finished doing an interview about this for Valeska Griffiths, and I said, the process for me is not very clear cut. Maybe it is for you folks, that you have a question that you start out and you answer. I kind of admire people who can do that, because for me it's much messier. I just kind of work around in the material until something starts to emerge, and sometimes you go down wrong paths. Like there's 20,000 words that didn't make it into the book because by the time I got them written, I talked myself out of what I thought my idea was. So I had to go back to the beginning. But the three ideas that I'm really excited about in this book, one is the idea of shifting from the horror genre to the horror mode. And genre is a function of marketing. Right? If you want a Hellraiser movie, you go to the horror, if you want Stephen King. But, if you wanted to look for something like Henry James' Turn of the Screw, you are as likely to find it in literature as in horror. So there's that. The horror mode is this emotional exchange, which does not depend particularly on, well, we have to have vampires, so we have to have zombies. It can be, it opens up the palette of what we can consider in terms of horror, especially opening it up in terms of religion. The other is that I'm really excited about and I want to pursue further is this idea of the religious imagination. Because we all have this idea. I mean, everybody, even if you're not religious, if somebody says the word religion to you, your brain, because we're pattern-seeking creatures, our brain just fills in, and it fills it in from what we know. And whether it's the pew we sit in on the weekends or, whatever. For me, everything that is religion in the world, whether it's Moloch worship or, primitive Baptists or, Buddhists, whatever it is, they are all at extrusions from what I think of as the religious imagination. So think of the religious imagination as this way we have of organizing things. Not all bits and pieces of that religious imagination find their way into the world as religion. Does that make sense? So if we think about it, if we take a step back and think about it as, now I'm going to think about the religion. I'm not going to worry so much about religion, like Catholicism or Islam or whatever. I want to take a step back and think about the religious imagination, because I think that's what really opens up science fiction and horror and fantasy to us. Because in my view, and I could be wrong about this, in my view, a lot of these products could be a novel, could be a graphic novel, movie, are actually showing us bits and pieces of the religious imagination at work in real time.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I think I'm going. And John expressed this best when he was interviewing. He stepped in very kindly at the 11th hour for the Mark Twain interview. He called it a thought experiment. And I think that's a really good way of looking at all of these things that I've done. Is they're less me telling people this is what is, than me kind of, roaming around thinking, this is kind of what I think is going on here. And you paid your money, you bought your book, you can interpret it the way you want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Doug, am I right that in some of your recent work and interviews and things, you've kind of shifted towards referring to the religious questions as properly human questions, even trying to expand a little bit further from those confines of religion?
Yeah, they're the same questions.
Yeah.
Just sort of, thanks for bringing that up. I started talking about that most early on in the Stephen King book, America's Dark Theologian. And, when you ask students, all of your students will know this, and you say, well, what are the great religious questions? What happens when we die? Is there really a God? Why is there suffering? Do we matter? Does the universe know our name? All of those kinds of stuff. And it occurred to me, especially when I was writing the Stephen King book, and especially dealing with his later material, especially stuff post like mid-90s. And sort of getting more into reading, going back to reading H.P. Lovecraft, the idea of these as religious questions, they are religion by convention only, more because, all religions claim to have answered them in one way or another, and they fight about what the answers are. But my argument is that they are religious questions only by convention. And when I say properly human questions, what I mean by that is that they belong to us by virtue of our human being, rather than our participation in this or that, that community of faith. I mean, when John and I met, I was, I hadn't yet moved to Kansas City, or maybe I had, but he knew I was a pastor at a United Church. I can't think United Methodist Church. I was a minister for 11 years. Now I'm sort of a straight up atheist. So we have this journey that we go on. But the questions for me, because I do not have this particular set of religious beliefs anymore, I still have all those questions. So that's why that's the distinction that I'm making. And I'm trying to kind of open that up so that people say, well, oh, science fiction, if those are human questions, and science fiction and horror and fantasy are storytelling ways that we explore the nature of what it means to be human in confrontation with X, Y, and Z, then these questions can be valuably and usefully answered through these storytelling means, as much as Bibles and Torahs and sutras and surahs and all like
almost
that.
Switching from the religious genre to the religious mode.
That's a really good way of putting it. That is a good way of putting it.
So Doug, in follow-up to that, would you say that perspective that you're bringing, you're challenging not only the popular conception of the average reader, but also the academy as well to rethink this kind of categorization?
Yeah, I mean, I remember this conversation. I was very early when I was here at Renison. It was like one of the old guy, the guy who was the New Testament prof when I got here. He was the big dog, and we were at a party, and he came up and he said, "So, are you?" And I was working on new religious movements at the time. And he says, "So you're still writing about, those weird little religions?" And I said, I don't know, because his big thing was Paul. He was working on this big magnum opus on the Apostle Paul. And I said, I don't know, you still writing about a guy who's been dead for 2,000 years? And I think that one of the things that we all struggle with, and I know Brandon and I have been in conversation about this, is our students come to us with this idea that they know what religion is. And it's what church is, and a huge part of what I'm trying to do here is say, look, it's way bigger than that. And the chapter on ritual sacrifice in this book is a good example of that, because especially with the 1931 King Kong, because basically what I'm saying there is, look, this is, for these people, this is religion as if their life depended on it, because as far as they were concerned, it did depend on it.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah. So Doug, one of the things you say, so I'm just fascinated by your journey, and I didn't know as much about your religious sort of ministry to atheism journey as I did about your journey through a variety of genres and or modes, right, that have interest in. So have to say, even though it will be met with some horror, that of the genres that you have written about, horror is probably the one that I've been least into sort of during my life. And yet, one of the things that I wrote, I can't remember whether I actually said this to the publisher or not, but after reading your book, I was like, okay, I get it now, right? This genre is just so fascinating. This type of literature, these stories are so fascinating. Got what's fun about being scared and exploring the mysterious and the spooky, and like the X-Files, like Doctor Who, like all kinds of things that are at the boundary and cross over the boundary between, say, sci-fi and horror, or the supernatural, the spooky. But I was like, now I get it. Now I get what's just so fascinating about this. But I was really struck by, you said at one point in the book that, horror sort of one of its characteristics is it takes religion more seriously and the supernatural more seriously than religions tend to in our day-to-day lives in the actual world. Mm-hmm. And I was really struck that that's something that could be said of sort of all the genres that you focused on. And so I wondered whether, first of all, whether that's something that has drawn you to them. And then also whether there has been any rhyme or reason to the order in which you have gone through sci-fi and Stephen King and fantasy and fairy tale and horror.
No. Okay, first of all, I'll answer these first. First, there's no order to it. It's just, I'm like this little academic butterfly. Mm-hmm. I kind of, light on a flower that I find interesting, and then I go off and I light on some other flower that I find interesting. But can I say though, James, that I'm so gratified to hear you say that, because that's what you've expressed is exactly what I want these books to do. It's exactly what I want them to do. I say this I don't know if I say them in every intro, but probably is I want all of these books to be invitational. I mean, I want them to be, this is an invitation into a way of thinking about something. It's not the only way. It may not even be the best way. It's, there are clearly other ways of thinking about it. But here's a way to look at this, especially if, you are in a community or have a family, or for whatever reasons of socialization present themselves, you have been either kept away or kept yourself away. Here's a way of thinking about these things. And so they are all of a piece in that. I think I probably started with Sacred Terror because of the Hellraiser motif and the whole story that I tell at the beginning of Sacred Terror. And then I probably went to Sacred Space next because science fiction is what I grew up with. That's really my thing. That's really my jam, is science fiction. And there is a companion book. I will tell you this. There's a companion book to America's Dark Theologian that will be coming out. I'm going to use my sabbatical to work on it. It's called America's Reluctant Prophet. And it is the religious imagination of Philip K. Dick. Right? So, and it'll be done in exactly the same kind of style as America's Dark Theologian. And then, so I did that, and I was doing the fantasy book. And I tell my students, you have to pay attention to these kind of moments. And we've all had them in our personal and academic lives. I met with Jennifer Hammer, who we probably all know. She's the editor and the acquisitions editor at NUY University Press. And she said, well, we were at the AAR, and she said, so what are you working on? What can we work on together? And I said, well, I kind of get this idea for this liquid modernity idea, and anti-heroes and streaming shows like Dexter, and everybody loves Dexter, but you do know he's a serial killer, right? And she went, yeah, that's okay. What else you got? And I swear I pulled this right out of my pocket. Well, I've always wondered about Stephen King and religion. That's as much as I had thought about it. It's as much as I knew. I hadn't read a Stephen King novel in like 30 years. So that's really cool. You should work that up. So I bought Dr. Sleep. It was the only Stephen King novel they had at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. I bought it and I read it on the plane home, and that became America's Dark Theologian. And then the Forbidden Body. So they are all of a piece, but each one I think does kind of build on another, because I don't like writing the same thing more than once. Does that make sense? I don't know if that answers your question.
Does. Yeah, I'm the same. I don't think there's a butterfly. I'm not sure it's like, ooh, bright, shiny new topic, right? And sort of chasing after it. But there's this shared borderlands at the very least, and some points of overlap, I think, between all of these. And maybe that's just true of all literature, which is why maybe it's more helpful to think about moods than genres. Yeah, I mean,
can I just follow up on that?
Yeah.
This, one of the things that I think is really that at least I've tried to seem to make important is the idea that religion is a function of storytelling. Whether it emerges and becomes, the Catholic Church, it is by definition a function of storytelling. And we all know that the weekly service, that is a function of storytelling, and the reality maintenance that takes place there is a function of continued storytelling. And if that's true, and we also find meaning in literature, whether it's science fiction or horror or whatever, that's why I argue that these are not competitors, and that one is not a necessary substrate to the other. But I think of science fiction and horror, especially horror, I think, science fiction and horror as what I call cultural siblings, because they are dealing with exactly that same kind of suite of questions. So I just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing I mentioned, I sort of threw two questions at you, and one is, that all of these genres seem to take, the reality of religion, of aspects of religion more seriously. And that's true not just of, let's say, Dracula, or of, whatever, something that features rituals that conjure, actual demons and things like that. Where, if anywhere, God is in that picture, is one of the interesting questions we might want to explore and poke at. But in Star Trek, right, which is often thought of as very secular, it's like, Apollo literally exists, right, and was exactly the way they described him. He just, was an alien.
Deep Space Nine is religious from its first episode to its very last.
Yeah. And there's this reality, but it's draped in the veneer of science, even though whether it's actually scientific is debatable. So I wonder if there's, I would love to hear you comment on what's different about the way religion is real across these different modes of storytelling or different genres.
In terms of I'm going to back away a little bit from the word real, because I don't want people to get the idea of there is fictional religion and real religion, because if I continue the metaphor of storytelling, all religions are fictions in the sense that they are storytelling, right? I know that may not be where everybody is with their religion, and I apologize, but one of the things that I tell all my students is everybody's an atheist. Everybody's an atheist. Everybody's an atheist. And they all look at me, they give me that, that look, right? And I said, really? Hands up all the Thor worshipers here. Hands up all the Moloch worshipers, and they go, and there's always somebody who goes, I worship Moloch. And I said, no, we hold on to our own gods, but the question is, why do we hold on to them? But we are atheists when it comes to other people's gods. And I think the great thing about, especially science fiction, like there's this great scene in Deep Space Nine, which is hands down my favorite of the series. It's my favorite. I've watched it through 5 or 6 times. There's this great scene between Kieran Reese and this person who has come through, this Bajoran who has come through from the alternate universe, the Van Dyke universe, right, where all the evil people wear Van Dykes, even the women, and she's come and she takes him into the temple, and there's a temple service going on, and he looks at her and he goes, what's going on here? Well, we're worshiping the prophets. Well, who are the prophets? Well, there are gods. And it ties right into that pilot, that little bit from the pilot where Jake Sisko says, you know, it's just stupid. Or it's not the pilot, it's when Kai Wynn shuts down the school, right? Because the kids are being taught heresy. And there's this whole tension. And the great thing about Deep Space Nine, and this is what I'm trying to do in my books, and we can talk about something that, you know, John, I just wrote for John and Brandon, is they never resolve the tension. The tension between, are the prophets aliens or are they gods, is never resolved. And that's what I think is so beautiful about that series.
Thanks. We give others a chance to say something.
Awkward silence.
Oh, yeah, Laura, jump in.
No, I was just gonna say that I think part of that is Ronald Moore. I think almost anything he touches has a kind of depth of religious imagination, like the way that he redid Battlestar Galactica.
Exactly.
And the new series he has his fingers in, For All Mankind, which is on Apple TV. I know not everybody watches it, but has both that kind of religious element about space, even though it's ostensibly a alternate history of the 60s to the Iran
Gemini
War.
project, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's a fascinating way that he has of kind of shaping those questions. And so I love that you brought up Deep Space Nine in that way, because I think it, of the Trek universe, is the one that recognizes that modernity didn't leave religion behind. It pretends that it did. but most of Star Trek, I think, and I'd be curious how you think about this, is in some ways about the religion of modernity, or the religious thinking that we have about modernity. And sometimes horror is inverting that thinking, right? So science is our value, and so how can science go awry and really turn out harming us more, or how is it scaring the crap out of us in ways that we don't recognize? And then the horror genre kind of lets us play with that. But Trek is such a great pivot for those. So I love that Deep Space Nine is kind of where you kind of, your inspiration came from, at least in part, to get this started.
Well, I mean, I love it. And the thing that I just wrote for John and Brandon is on monster theory. And one of the things that I in this book, I'm a little hard on people as well, I think. Maybe unjustifiably so, maybe justifiably. But what I'm also trying to get away from is this idea, and this goes back to James's question, what I'm trying to get away from, or not get away from, but encourage people to think in a slightly different way about, than that kind of superficial treating whatever the pop culture product is as a riddle. And once we've solved the riddle, and Battlestar Galactica, which I loved, except I loved for 3.5 seasons, because, you know, as Gaius Baltar said, you know, as Fuchs said to Gaius Baltar, you know, God has a plan for your life, but Ronald Moore was making it up as he went along in the 4th season. But the point is, when you started to read early kind of scholarship and pops, what we might call pop scholarship around Battlestar Galactica, it was always about figuring out what was the equation, right? Who were the Cylons? Well, the humans, they're Greeks and they have all these gods, and who are the Cylons? And it's all about trying to pigeonhole religion, whatever we see on the screen, in terms of real religion. And that's why I'm really trying to pull people away from is when I say, this goes back to James' question, rather, by taking it seriously, what I mean is take it on its own terms. Like accept accept the terms of the story that is being told in exactly the way I, as a sociologist, would accept the terms of a religious story that's being told to me. I mean, I've hung out with Scientologists. There are not 10 million Scientologists in the world. Don't let them ever tell you that. I mean, it's nonsense. But I would never say that to a Scientologist. That's your belief, that's your faith system. Accept that. So the idea of taking religion on its own terms in the context without feeling the need to turn the Bajorans. I mean, the worst was that New York Times review by John Perellis when he said, the Bajorans are what do you say? They are Indians. He called the Ferengi the Shylocks of space. The Ferengi are wonderful. They're probably my favorite species.
You've talked in your work about the distinction between treating these works like they're riddles versus treating them like they're enigmas. Mm-hmm. I found that to be just a really helpful framework for thinking through what kind of connections we're making and how we're really approaching these questions.
Yeah, it was really helpful for me. I mean, as much as, like I say, it's a thought experiment. I'm trying to figure this stuff out. It was really helpful for me because I was so dissatisfied. And you and I, we all know from having read the scholarship that the idea of making some kind of superficial equation as though what's going on screen or in a book must stand as a metaphor does not take seriously the religious lives of people for whom these things are not. It's the problem with The Exorcist. And you're all my friends, so I can say this, and we've met, so you know me. I desperately tried to find a way to make "Let Jesus Fuck Me" be the first 4 words of the book. And I just couldn't find a way to make it work that didn't feel gratuitous.
So sorry.
I know, right? But I got it in there. But the idea of treating what Reagan's experience is as because you read all kinds of stuff about this where, a psychologist says, well, obviously because demons don't exist, this must be about something else. It must be a metaphor for something else. It must be a metaphor for menstruation. She's 12, so she's starting to menstruate, and this is this giant metaphor. It's Billy Friedkin made a 2-hour extravaganza about menstruation, which seems a little bit odd when you say it that way. The best one I read, though, was that this person has wandered so far into the Freudian wilderness. She said that the fact that Reagan is masturbating with the crucifix means that she wants to have sex with the Pope. I'm like, I don't know.
I also wonder if what that kind of approach is doing is it's less about looking at it as metaphors and more using poor metaphor theory, that it's being stuck in the Aristotelian model of metaphors where you have substitutions one for one, as opposed to a Ricoeurian model where metaphors have a surplus of meaning. And all of these things could possibly be true and could be possible interpretations, but the final answer, if you will, always escapes. You can never get to it.
I wish you and I had this conversation when I was writing that chapter, because that's a much more elegant and parsimonious way of saying exactly what I was trying to do in that chapter without invoking Ricoeur. Because at some point I do say, it's not that they're wrong. Psychological interpretations of horror, it's not that they're wrong. Sociological, it's not that they're wrong. It's just they fail by virtue of incompleteness. They fail by virtue of overreach.
By incompleteness and by pretending that they are complete, or portraying themselves as if they're complete. That's
exactly
where
right.
the real problem comes in.
Like I say, I wish we'd had this conversation 2 years ago.
Doug, one of the things I appreciate about the book was you grappled with materials in the text, not just ideas, but actual artifacts, cultural materials that I was not familiar with. You expanded my awareness of different things. And one of the things I really appreciated was the art. So my question is, I've got several books on fantasy art and science fiction art, and especially horror art, because I just find it fascinating and beautiful and dark at the same time. Was that art aspect already a part of your area of interest, or was it something that, because you're grappling with the subject matter, you wanted to expand the kinds of material you were interacting with?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was. I mean, I've always, even though I make my living writing about things and talking about them, I've always been basically a visual person. I'm a visual learner. When I plot, to the extent that I do plot a chapter, I use a mind map. So I don't do it this way. So my library is all like graphic novels and stuff, right? And I too have been fascinated by horror art, and I began working with this idea of the availability heuristic. The more easily we can call to mind, right? We all know what that is. It's axiomatic that more people are going to see the cover of a book or a movie poster, and then they are going to build an impression of what's going on based on that poster or that artwork. And especially, like, the ones that were the most fun to work with were actually the pulp covers. Right, I mean, in the chapter on sacrifice. And because, I mean, I had a plethora of data. There were all kinds of examples. I remember calling up Jennifer Hammer and say, okay, you gave me 15 images. I have 16. Can I have 30? And they said no. It's because there's money involved, right? But I especially liked being able to branch out beyond simply the norm, like the idea of pointing to, like, where are these things coming from? Like the idea of the sexualized witch. The idea of the sexualized witch, we have this very ambivalent relationship with what that is. And I'd been seeing, I've got files where I've clipped these Pear soap ads out, and so the idea of dealing with art, especially the art of Margaret Brundage, who did more of these weird tales, and she was a fascinating character. I read a couple of 6-foot-tall chain smoker, who was 6-foot-tall chain smoker, single mother. She walked into weird tales because she was living in Chicago and she had no way of getting anywhere else. She walked into weird tales with her because she's fashion trained. That's why her artwork has this kind of gauzy feel to it. She walked into Weird Tales office in Chicago because it was the only one she could get to. So and she did more covers than anybody else. So it was baked in from the beginning.
Other thoughts, questions?
Something I was hoping to talk with you more about, Doug. A few months before publication, you and I were talking. I think we had an email exchange about your proposed title and things like that. You were considering the title "Bodies Out of Place." I hope that's okay to share. So that you've got the kind of the combination of Judith Butler with her ideas of bodies that matter, that we value some bodies, we don't value others. Propaganda is about enforcing or pushing ideas of which bodies should be valued, and then combining that with Mary Douglas and her idea of dirt being matter out of place. Mm-hmm. I thought the collision of those two ideas was just fascinating. I think that phrase shows up in the book a few times.
That was the title.
That was the title
of the book until 2 weeks before it went into production. And it was the marketing team at NYUP that said, we get it, we're not sure it's going to have such great curb appeal.
From a scholarly perspective, I just love the Butler and Douglas matchup.
That was entirely the point of the title "Bodies Out of Place," and which is why the phrase shows up so often in the text, because that was supposed to be the title. The whole time I worked on it until 2 weeks before they went into production, the book was called Bodies Out of Place. And I still think it's a better title.
Those two ideas really do seem to animate the book.
I know, right? But I'm not in marketing. It's not my thing. They gave me a cool cover.
They sure did.
They gave me a choice of 2 covers, and I put it out on Facebook. Which one? I mean, I was going to choose, but I put it out on Facebook to have my friends say which one they thought. That was hands down the favorite. The one which we went with was hands down the favorite. So it's a really good pickup, Brandon. That, like I say, it's this idea of how bodies become out of place, and how emplacement is a function of group and society and culture. And go ahead.
And how religion and horror have particular rules, particular categories, particular mechanisms for putting these bodies in place, ensuring they stay there, and
exactly
what happens when they get out of those places.
Yeah. How do you bring them back into place? Can they be brought back into place? I know it's I will admit to some disappointment. I mean, I'm not unhappy, but I will admit to a little bit of disappointment that didn't get to be the title of the book.
Well, let me jump in with we've got to make sure we get at least some biblical studies mentioned in here, at least briefly, although we'll probably veer away from it. But I've just been thinking, as I was thinking about this conversation, about the fact that in biblical studies, it seems like there's been more attention paid to bodies and the bodily, I think, in recent years than perhaps before that. And in particular, just recently read Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, God and Anatomy, which is all about sort of the bodily character of the God of ancient Israel, who walks in the garden, but also comes drenched in the blood of his enemies and things like that. And you can't, if you're disembodied, abstract, ethereal, you can't really get drenched in blood, or do various other things that are part of the repertoire of language in ancient Israel storytelling. And so, thinking about that attention, there's a lot less separation, I think, in the Bible, even into the New Testament, than there was subsequently, right? I mean, you get this real attempt to sort of separate matter and spirit in ways that we're never going to make sense, and we're never going to really fly with people. But at least in theory, right, there's this idea we still talk about our minds as though they are separate from our bodies, even though they are completely rooted in them. I'm also, in addition to the biblical studies stuff and doing things on popular culture, I'm also married not just to a Romanian but to a Transylvanian, and so I should have read Dracula before that happened, but didn't. But Dracula fascinated me, especially because I was interested in how this place has been used to market the part of the world my wife is from, and also give it a bad reputation and various other things. But the fact that, thinking about, for instance, crucifixes and how they appear in horror and are used in some very different ways, but sometimes there seems to be this potency for warding off evil, but there's still this question of, where's God the rest of the time, and why does it take the crucifix showing up? And then somewhere the supposedly powerful relic or object or artifact symbol seems to actually, it's prone to mistreatment in ways that its human makers would not have intended for it to be used. And so I wonder what, in terms of thinking about sort of evil in religion, and thinking about sort of the fact that what horror gets at is the fact that the things that we tend to think of as evil are part of us, are woven into the fabric of humanity, and it really sort of lifts the lid on that, and sometimes even takes it to extremes. I was thinking about that. I'm not sure. I'm really struggling to know how to ask the question because in terms of, basically where is God with a capital G in it? Because there's plenty of room for gods, frightening gods, old gods in horror, and their equivalents in science fiction. But yeah, Battlestar Galactica tried to weave in God with a capital G, and that's really when things started to, when that stopped being, when they tried to really pursue that, that's when the show got disappointing, I think was the way you put it. And so do you have any thoughts on sort of where God is? Because when I asked about the reality of sort of God, the supernatural in horror and in science fiction, I wasn't thinking about real as in like real world real, but real within the narrative of the story, sometimes in ways that don't reflect the way that we think, talk, act. Even people who are religious in this world don't think, talk, act as though you might actually encounter a deity or an angel in quite the way that characters sometimes do.
Yeah, I mean, I can give my answer, but I'll also be really interested in what you all think about this question as well, because I think especially writing, in a North American context, it's a really important question given the kinds of students that show up in our classes. For me, I think there are two things that I'm trying to do with this. One is point out that where God, let us just say big G God, where big G God is in a lot of these is a point of tension and contention in a lot of these stories, because you get differing interpretations often, especially in stories about what we would colloquially call cults, and we're going to all put that in air quotes. When one set of believers looks at another set of believers who ostensibly believe in the same God, then look at them and go, oh, no. There's the heretics over there, buddy. And I say to my students, what do you think the group over there is saying when they look back this way? So I think for me, the idea of the big G God is in fact a point of tension in these stories. And the idea of artifacts is really interesting, because when you start looking at horror multiculturally, you find exactly the same thing showing up. How do you what is one of the mechanisms by which you defeat Kyonsi, or hopping ghosts in Chinese horror, Kyonsi, or vampires who rise because funeral rites have not been performed correctly? It's the hexagram diagram of the I Ching that is used to defeat them in virtually identical way to a crucifix is in the Dracula story, right? So you have all of these kind of, and for me, what that speaks to is the larger question of the way humans tend to immanentize religious power. Because you're right, it's one thing to think about, well, maybe God will save me, but I'm going to clutch my crucifix anyway, because that makes shit real right here. But I'd really like to know what else you all think of it, because I think it's a really good question.
I'll rush in as fools rush in quickly. Just a thought I had when you were saying that. It's interesting that you see this age-old human question expressed, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, the hiddenness or the apparent absence of God. Where is God in the midst of my struggle and need for deliverance? And in the present, in the American Christian context, you're starting to see more philosophers and apologists interact with atheist critiques on the hiddenness of God as a problem. And so it's interesting that you've got horror many times addressing this issue. Here we've got this supernatural threat and problem, and we expect God to intervene and deliver us from it, and yet he doesn't seem to be doing it. And so therefore, let's grab on to the rituals and the processes that we need to go through, which we assume God's going to use to intervene in this problem. So it's interesting to see contemporary horror addressing some of these same challenges that even philosophers, apologists, and so on are doing at the same time. That's kind of an initial thought I had. Anyone else? Don't be afraid to rush in. Any thoughts? James, I could see the wheels turning.
think, I was just going to
Go ahead,
add
Laura.
that sometimes it's a part of God's bureaucracy, right? There are minions that get involved. So, but God's self, wherever they are, isn't available. Maybe they're very busy, or but that these other kind of proxies wind up acting in both capacities, because I guess the devil makes an appearance, but demons, I think, are fairly common in supernatural horror, where maybe the head honcho, Satan, doesn't always make his appearance. So maybe part of it has to do with in our religious imagination, that kind of bureaucratized heaven. I mean, and that's not new to Christianity, right? Augustine had it in City of God, and sort of imagined that it was just going to be a more perfect version of kind of the bureaucracies we were living in. I don't know. Just a thought there.
I think you're right. You're really onto something there. Kind of this idea that, I mean, to fall back on cliches, we serve as God's hands on this earth, so that the point of some of these rituals is that somehow the human protagonists can get in some way connected to God and exercise that power through that. I think that's one strand that we see frequently. In some of my recent work, I've also been really interested in the kinds of horror movies where the horror itself emanates from Big G God. Looking at an article or a movie like The Mist, based on the Stephen King novella, where I think there's a really plausible reading of that roots everything in the will of God, and that finally all these monsters disappear when the sacrifice is undertaken at the end.
Who's I mean, when you read the novella, who is the most disturbing character in the novella?
Oh, the religious nutcase
Of
is
course,
terrifying.
right?
Yeah. But the movie adds that twist at the end that it has some implications that maybe she was right. That the sacrifice she calls for is undertaken, and then everything goes away, and we have the problem solved. Or like the French movie Martyrs that came out recently. I guess that's maybe a decade or so old, but there really is this kind of thread of movies that posit Big G God as the cause of horror. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, just circling back, I had an idea for a book series once. It's a terrible idea. We would all enjoy reading these books, and we would probably write them, but I'm not sure that, other than us, we'd have any readers or authors for this series. There are a few other people that we know of probably that would join in, but it was the idea of maybe having a series of books, probably thin books, but like theologies of fictional worlds, which was essentially, what would, if you were trying to be a theologian in the world in which, let's say it's the world of Doctor Who, and so, there are Gallifreyans, and one of them likes to spend a lot of time on Earth in the UK, and, more recently relocating more to Wales than, whatever. But, right. And then you have, what would the theology be of, that you'd create if you actually are trying to be a theologian in that universe, right? Doing theology as though this is what life is actually like, because of course so much of that what's there is not life as we've experienced it, right? What is the theology of a book like Dracula, a novel like Dracula, right? It's like, I give you recipes for holy water and everything you need. Why are you expecting some kind of intervention to stop vampires and things like that? It's like, what's the how do you make sense of that imagined world as though it were a real world, and try to be like the character of a theologian within the narrative, as it were?
So not applying the categories of theology from our world to, like something like theology in the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something like that, where you use Augustine to read these, but really existing within this fictional world and creating a theology from that. Right?
So not the gospel according to approach, but the what does it look like to do God talk, which is theology? What does it look like to do God talk from within the context?
Yeah.
I think it's a fascinating idea, quite frankly. I think, what? I think you could, maybe not a series of books, but dude, I bet you could get a bunch of people to do that for an edited collection. I totally believe that. I'd buy that. I'd buy
Would
that
you-
and read it.
Would you grab the Hellraiser chapter in that book, Doug?
You know what? I don't know. I don't know whether I would or not. Because what I was going to talk about when Laura was talking about bureaucratization, I immediately went back to the City Infernal series by a splatter horror author named Edward Lee. Publishes mostly through small presses, has had a couple of successes, makes his money mostly by virtue of the fact that he's extraordinarily prolific. But he has this five novel series called the City Infernal series, and he imagines hell, which he calls Mephistopheles, as this extraordinarily bureaucratized. And I had a whole chapter mapped out, but the book is already 10% longer than I was allowed. But I had this whole chapter mapped out on, and the chapter was going to be called The Gospel According to Edward Lee. And it was all about this kind of inversion of these Augustinian categories. And, you have like St. Boniface Seminary, one of the anti-popes. You have, Admiral Tojo Memorial Hospital. Right. And and he takes such unbelievable delight in inverting all these categories. Now, to get back to Edward Lee does come back to James's initial question about where is God in a very slim book called The Teratologist that he wrote with another horror author named Rath James White. And before you immediately go and decide to get it on Amazon, I will tell you, it is without doubt the book that was most difficult for me to read from start to finish. It's not even a horse race, because this guy's a splatter horror author. And the whole thing is, it's essentially Job, but it's kind of inverts Job in that this rich dude is going to do the most disgusting things imaginable, especially to religious people, especially to religious professionals, as a way of saying, if I am doing such horrible things that if God ever existed, God would come down and stop me. So it's kind of inverting Job, but it's a really, really difficult book to read. And I it was kind of like, for me, it was, all right, I have to read the fucking thing. And because, I had to read it because I had to read it to know what was going on. But it's one of these novels that poses that question. Where is? And, I'm not going to encourage you to read it, but so I'll spoil the ending. In the ending, Big G God does come in. Big G God does make an appearance. But Big G God basically says, y'all got me wrong. I am not like anything any of you ever imagined. It's this very Lovecraftian ending. But I think there are lots and lots of works in the horror mode that are wrestling with exactly that question that James poses.
That just sounds like an inversion of the pious unbeliever, right? The pious unbeliever who lives by all of God's laws, daring God to show God's self. That this is an invert of that sounds. I take your warning very seriously about the splatter horror, so I'll step back from that. But really, that just sounds like a very fascinating kind of way of inverting an age-old sort of big G God question.
It sounds like a book I'm really glad to hear you talk about, Doug.
Yeah, it's like your hometown's a nice place to have been from. But I know it was hard to read. I mean, the City Infernal novels are fun. They have this, he's doing his thing as a splatter horror author, because where I wanted to go with, and again, this is stuff I didn't get to do, is an author that I've read for a long time, a writer I've read for a long time, and I've actually written about 35,000 words about, trying to kind of form into a book. I haven't quite got it figured out yet, is the Marquis de Sade. And this idea of a Sadean imaginary, not Sade, not Donatien Alphonse de Sade, but Sade. You know, the way we have imagined him. I remember reading, it wasn't 120 Days, it was something else. Maybe Juliet or Justine. I was sitting in a coffee shop, and I was reading like one of these, and it was one of the Grove Press editions. So it has, you know, Marquis de Sade, and I'm reading it in this coffee shop, and somebody in the coffee shop said to me, "How can you possibly read that stuff? He was a murderer and a filthy person." And I said, "Well, have you read it?" And they said, "Oh no, I would never read that." There's an awful lot going on in Sade, and it invokes an awful lot of exactly the same questions, especially he has this novella called Philosophy in the Bedroom, which is a dialogue between a priest and a dying man, and it invokes a lot of the same questions that we're talking about.
Well, we've been going for an hour, and I don't want to presume that you folks have a whole lot of time on your schedule, but I do need one pressing question I have that relates to some of our prior conversations. Doug, you mentioned when we were doing the Mark Twain conversation that you discovered that this topic really hadn't been addressed before, which is fascinating. Is it possible that even though horror pushes the boundaries, is transgressive, scholars are trying to do the same and uncover new territory, that the impact of religious sensibilities in the West has prevented scholars from seeing this as a topic where we can take the big G and connect it with questions of horror and the body and all the messiness and things that goes with that, and the taboos. It kind of has inhibited the willingness to consider this an area for this kind of exploration. Anything to that idea?
Yeah, I think that's right on. I think you're absolutely correct about that. I mean, I've had people, I mean, it might have been James, but I don't think so. And I've had people come to me and say, you know, I read Sacred Terror, and I felt like it gave me permission to do this kind of stuff. And you asked a good question when we did the Mark Twain event. You know, did I feel any, like, was I worried about pushback? And at my stage in career, I'm not. You know, I'm really not, but I can totally understand how an early career scholar, somebody trying to break into the tenure track, for example, or an early career scholar, depending on the departmental and institutional culture in which they are working, I can, you know, we have academic freedom unless we don't, you know, you know, I was able to do this by virtue of the sort of the departmental culture and the institutional culture I have, and where I live and write. But I'm really aware of the fact that that's an extraordinarily privileged position from which to work. Because another, you know, if you've ever, you know, I've heard people want to write about new religious movements, for example. They say, but I want to get tenure. Right? They want to write about science fiction, but nobody else in their department takes it seriously. And I guess maybe I never thought about it this way, but maybe what's sort of subconscious in my wanting to do this kind of work is saying, you know, young scholar, you can now take this and go, you know, this guy that somebody gave a PhD to, he did it. You know, so, you know, not everybody's, it's a good question. And I think it's one that bears further exploration, especially since we've probably all seen lots of examples where we thought the protections for academic freedom were in place, they turned out, in fact, not to be.
I think if you were writing these books at an institution in Florida, DeSantis would find a way to get rid of you. Yeah.
Dude. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are lots of, there are just, I mean, I don't worry too much about what people say. I don't read reviews of my work unless somebody sends them to me. I mean, because usually if if somebody I know or a friend of mine reviews it, they send it to me because they're being kind. But I mean, when I wrote Magic and Monsters, um, one of the preeminent folklorists in the UK reviewed it for the Times Literary Supplement, and she gushed about it. She said it was wonderful. She's very kind. She sent me a copy of it. Exactly the same time frame, some folklorists from Germany reviewed it and basically took 900 words to say, who gave this idiot a PhD anyway? Right? And they're writing about the same book. So I don't get caught up too much in that, but I do recognize as I said, the extraordinary privilege of the sort of location from which I'm writing. And it would be very difficult and I'm hoping as time goes on, it gets less difficult because I think it's important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, your reaction to book reviews can also be said about peer review many times. So
I remember a
Right,
conversation you and I had about that.
right. Well, any closing thoughts or comments from folks? I could do this, I would love to have, here's another idea. Just occasional groups of scholars of religion, science fiction, or horror getting together for periodic recorded conversations on what comes to mind about topics. I think would be fascinating. But
Yes,
You could all
please.
watch the same sort of Netflix thing or some movie that's coming up and talk about that.
yeah.
That'd be fun. I want to know where the Flying Saucer restaurant is.
Oh, the Flying Saucer restaurant. The Flying Saucer restaurant is in Niagara Falls. It's on the Canadian side. And if you've ever been to, I've never been to the American side, but if the American side is anything like the Canadian side, once you come off Clifton Hill, which is where all the casinos and the haunted houses and the roller coasters are, you realize what a grody little border town Niagara Falls really is. I don't know what the American side is like, but off the beaten path, there is this restaurant called the Flying Saucer Restaurant, and it is built like a flying saucer. And you go in, and it's like you're in a flying saucer, and it's basically a Denny's. I mean, the food is about the level of a Denny's. But when my wife and we always go to Niagara Falls in the dead of winter after the Valentine's Day weekend because the rooms are really cheap. The rooms are really cheap, and you tend to get floor to ceiling window rooms overlooking the frozen falls, which I think is beautiful. But whenever we do that, we go to the Flying Saucer restaurant. So that's where it is. I don't even know if it's still there. Maybe it didn't survive the pandemic.
Next time I go, I'll take a look and I'll let you know.
There you go. There you go. Well, I'm really thank you so much. I know John did yeoman service trying to pull all of us together at a time that's tough, but I appreciate you all so much for everything, for all the inspiration that y'all give me and the time that you've spent.
I feel so honored to have been included in this conversation. Thank you.
Did we ever hear back from Scott?
No, the only time I've reached out to Scott several times via email and just haven't heard back. I did hear from him on Twitter. He's got a book coming out, and I said I'd like to talk to him, have one of these conversations to help promote it. But I don't know if he's got things going on academically or otherwise. So if you guys
may
know,
be even more of a hermit than I am.
Yeah.
Because my lifestyle is such that my life didn't change very much with the pandemic because I'm happy at home.
Yeah. Well, thanks to everybody for carving out the time on a Saturday to talk about this. We'll put in the program notes a link to the book and to Doug's academic website and his other books to promote it as well. And I just want to thank everybody. And if you folks would also send me this follow-up a link that you would like to promote you and what you're doing as participants, I'm always happy to promote everybody. This is a collaborative venture, and Theo Fantastique is privileged to host everything you guys are doing.
Yeah, I've been just on that note. I've been pimping Brandon's book on the witch.
Well, thank you. I sure appreciate it.
Yeah, good stuff.
Well, thank you guys. Again, I appreciate it. It's been a privilege.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
so much,
It's really
everybody.
great. Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Take care of yourselves.